At the opening of hostilities at midnight, October 4th, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had knocked down all of the eyes and ears of America, as well as communications capabilities, including with the on-booting of local electronic warfare jamming assets provided by both the Chinese and the Russian forces present throughout the nation, inside and around it. The city of Houston, America's fourth largest city, and perhaps among the chief cities of its energy infrastructure, namely storage and refining of fuels, this city was a key target for the coalition forces involved in its capture. And unlike in the previous installation or subseries of the larger fourth generation warfare hypothetical invasion documentary series, which in the previous installment featured the sub-series of the Waco battle, mammoth air support would be involved in the capture of this enormously large city. Also drastically more ground forces as well, and heavier and more diverse, as the air power and the massive land power being utilized to capture the city would also likewise be supported by a relatively formidable sea arm in the form of the already screening forces for the overall invasion's kickoff of the bi-coastal Sino-Russian naval drills, as Chinese predominantly and Russian ships up and down both coasts, with also some from allied nations, were conducting these massive drills, which had, with America's poor economic state, caused them to not only have a very large grouping of their ships moored away in port due to the costs of deployments and the fuel, minus those that had nuclear-capable engines, and also the parts required to keep them maintained, costing a lot of money, and the recent budget cuts causing these things, with a very minimal number of these vessels taking to the coasts and the littoral areas to patrol the seas along their nation. But the number of Chinese and Russian vessels of all types, and also those of their allies, was simply far too much to contend with in the conventional sense, as in just this area alone, this one small area off the coast of America with more ships beyond, there were 8 PLAN vessels in the form of 4 Song-class submarines, or the Type 039As, and also which were a very quiet diesel-electric sub, and they have proven their worth time and time again, sneaking up on nations that allegedly had some of the best submarine detection equipment in the world, Japan being one, until they had surfaced and revealed themselves within the range of these systems, as well as also the stealth cruisers known as the Type 055s, equipped with their own Aegis-like system, which was upgraded on these vessels, a step up from even that was on the Type 52D, the regular destroyers. These, essentially, were fully capable of engaging air, land, and sea targets with all of their missile cells at the same time, tracking all these different types of targets and engaging them. And not only would the Song-class subs launch volley after volley of YJ-18B, which is the submarine-launched cruise missile of the YJ-18, at the land-based targets, the Type 055s would play a particularly destructive role as well, as the Sino-Russian naval drills were a screen over the entire larger invasion that was being set up deep inland with the Trojan shock forces that would appear ubiquitously throughout every corner of the land, as well as the external forces crossing both borders and landing on both coasts. And just in this one small area, there was the 8 different vessels between the 4 subs and the 4 stealth destroyers or cruisers, the Renhai class, as mentioned, and also the Type 075 helicopter carrier vessels utilized by each of the 2 PLAN Marine brigades operating in just this one area, as there were 4 other PLAN Marine brigades, and there was also their paramilitary militia landing in other parts of the coast, as well as also allied units that would be beach landing, whether these were army forces of other nations or also naval-oriented forces, such as Marines from certain nations or otherwise. These forces were also bulked up within specially designed cargo ships that could be unloaded with the capture intact of special port facilities, such as those located in the Texas City, Texas area, which would be captured intact by elements within these PLAN Marine forces, namely of their 1st Brigade landing in that area, with the 6th Brigade landing to the northeast of Houston, along the coast of Texas, nearer to Louisiana, with them then unloading these troops from these cargo ships, namely their heavier assets from within these Marine forces, getting them on land quickly and assisting in the fighting that would already be occurring a bit deeper inland between the 83rd Group Army, which was another active duty PLA Group Army with its different combined arms brigades, and also the 36th People's Armed Police Brigade, which was a standard People's Armed Police Brigade equipped with wheeled vehicles, both the WZ-551 APC and IFV versions. And although the PAP did have its own artillery forces, as well as also actual light armored forces in the form of light tanks passed down from the PLA in the form of the Type 62 Guy and other types of armor, these forces were just the standard array of garden variety People's Armed Police forces. And although these forces specialized in brutally crushing uprisings and partisan and insurgent elements, they could fully also take on military assets, including with the enormous, whopping number of aircraft in the form of the air support they would be receiving from the coalition air forces involved. Specifically over just only the Houston metro area alone, there would be 2 PLAAF fighter squadrons, 1 J-10 and 1 J-20 stealth fighter squadron, which would be accompanied and shadowed by 1 FH-97A fighter drone per J-20 fighter jet, with the J-10s not being paired with such, but these were produced in enormous numbers by the Chinese, these J-10s, and were very capable multi-role fighter aircraft and would play a role in the battle occurring in Houston, as well as would also a Russian fighter squadron of Su-27 fighter aircraft, and perhaps more than anything else, a Russian Tu-22M bomber squadron, each one alone able to carry 53,000 pounds of air-dropped ordnance on a target area. Unlike at the previous installment or sub-series of this larger South Central / Texas predominantly invasion hypothetical fourth generation warfare series, in the Waco battle, where only almost half of the 68th PLA Group Army was involved, plus only 2 battalions coming from the Russians who were assisting the bulk of the 68th, or exactly half of it, with its heaviest elements fighting in the Fort Hood battle, as well as 2 of the very heavy 2nd Combined Arms Army elements that were participating in that battle with them, which 2 of their battalions had pursued fleeing American forces into the Waco area, with very minimal air support coming from armed combat and heavily armed high-altitude recon drones in the form of only 7 when combining the 5 Wing Loon 2s and the 2 CH-4As. The fighting in Houston would be drastically different. It would be much faster, as the American forces, coming from forces within its 36th Infantry Division, a National Guard entity which had elements of it from even other states, that was mobilized and all sent into the Texas area, including at Houston, no less, as this was one of the nation's critical cities at the 4th largest in population, although not in terms of its metro area as a whole. It still had a very large metro area, nearly as big as that consisting of DFW, which was a combo of several very large cities and a bunch of medium cities. Houston was right behind them in terms of overall metro area population, but the city of Houston proper was America's 4th biggest city. And it was also a piece of critical port infrastructure along the Gulf Coast, as the port areas in this metro area were vastly important to the Americans, as well as the fact that one of the largest oil refineries in the world was located in Texas City, Texas, of which the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade would be responsible for capturing and holding, among some of its other objectives, like taking the port facilities intact as well to be able to unload the heavier elements of their Marine Brigade, with the 6th landing to the northeast of the Houston area and seizing control of a large swathe of the coast, where Louisiana came together with Texas, although on the Texas side predominantly. As the communications would be completely and totally removed, as well as a critical component of America's ISR capabilities in the form of the loss of their military satellites, as well as also their commercial satellites that they could have used for surveillance, because those would be taken down immediately following the first salvo of the Dongnaeng 2s and 3s and also S-500s and other types of anti-satellite capable weapon systems, who had been tracking these satellites meticulously for the day they would be shot down, after satellite dazing had temporarily disguised the buildups going on in both Canada and Mexico, with the actions allowed to be seen in the waters around both coasts, because that was meant to be not just a distraction, but would also eventually play a role in the invasion itself. It caused the Americans to become a bit haphazard in their deployments, and also, as America was very slow to mobilize already as it were, some of the forces in different areas and different states were mobilized a bit faster than were others. And the average between all 50 states was anywhere between 40 and 60% on average of the different Guard and reservists mobilized, with Texas being in the roughly 60 percentile range of having its forces mobilized. This meant forces within the 36th ID and attached to it, including forces from neighboring Louisiana, of which a small number would be sent to help with the defense of the Houston area as a precaution, as the Americans they figured that if there would be any type of attack, it would be a very small-scale attack and not a full-on invasion. But because they would never know for sure in their rationale, in their way of thinking, where an attack would come, they tended to scatter their resources, which were very limited, in all manner of areas, which thinned out their already stretched out forces even more. And they did their best to focus them in places they figured would be the most likely areas of attack, although they were fully aware of the fact that the failed border policies led to a very real potential of something occurring anywhere, which is what caused the forces to become stretched in the first place. As multiple forces comprised of naval ground forces in the form of 2 PLAN Marine brigades, a PAP brigade on land of paramilitary forces in the Houston area, and the entire 83rd PLA Group Army, which itself was a force of 58,000 troops, not counting the other 8,000 of the 36th PAP Brigade and the additional other 8,000 from the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade, not even counting its 6th, which would go to the northeast of the city. There were already considerable forces gathering to blitz this city. And this city would fall even faster than did Oklahoma City or Dallas-Fort Worth and some of the other larger cities, because this city would be struck by a massive volume of combined air, sea, and ground power concentrated in a very small area. Although this was the case in some of the other battles throughout the deep insides of the nation, along this part of the Gulf Coast, it was apparent that it was within close striking range of the external forces, as well as sea-based forces and Trojan forces originating in CCP property strategically purchased inside of the metro area itself. Positioning would also play a key role in how fast this battle would progress. In totality, the battle would last 18 hours over this city. The fighting would not, and the positioning of the PLA forces and coalition entities partaking in the fighting would not allow for there to be any types of defensive positions built in any real strength, and would then devolve into a series of insurgent-type hit-and-run tactics. As although the military defeat of the forces in the area would be all but assured in 18 hours, the armed civilian uprisings would be fought for some time after, and would be up to the PAP forces to carry out the will of the party and brutally crush and suppress these forces, which would lead to the mass torching of enormous neighborhoods within this city by the use of the incendiary weapons that they loved so much and had used in putting down restive groups in Xinjiang and other places, such as the Type 74 flamethrower, and also airstrikes, which would be conducting follow-up attacks after the initial air raids had concluded, as many of these aircraft would be taking off from installations in parts of Mexico, Nicaragua, and also Venezuela and Cuba, with the Russian bomber forces in particular taking off from Venezuela, which for them, due to their long flight distance that they were fully capable of achieving, only having to fly back and forth to the Houston area from their base, as they were earmarked specifically for this particular battle alone, they would be able to do round trip, round the clock, carpet bombing raids, if the operation so called for it, with ease. As could the fighter aircraft, after finding no aviation fixed-wing targets of their own in this particular battle space, would be able to return to base and switch out their air-to-air munitions for complete full loadouts of air-to-ground munitions to add their weight to the fighting. Again, the fighting over Houston would be somewhat more short-lived compared to other cities throughout the South Central Invasion Corridor, especially cities of this magnitude. The only other one that would last a bit shorter than this would be the San Antonio area, as that would have to be taken extremely fast due to the close proximity to the border and the externals having to pass through that city first out of the big and medium-sized cities they had to move through to get to their ultimate objectives deep inland, where they would begin to fan out. In the Houston area, I-10 was of the utmost importance for the invasion prong of external group armies 15 through 20, who would be moving up after conducting and winning the McAllen battle, which would be a short 6-hour battle, before moving into the American Southeast, before they too would begin to fan out, although they would jettison one of their group armies to relieve the 83rd by the end of the first day, who would then move from day 2 to day 3 into the Texarkana, Texas area, before they too would then fan out after taking a time to do a logistical resupply prior to their departure. As the PLAN Marines would also play a big role in this battle, they primarily would be focused on the southeasternmost suburban areas of the metro area adjacent to the coast, before they then too would eventually move inland and assist the People's Armed Police, shock troops, and the PLA forces in their occupation of their new acquisitions. But this would be after they had fully seized the ports and the oil facilities along the coast, and then unloaded the rest of their brigade in the form of the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade. With the air power a constant, ever-present threat to any and all American forces that would dare to resist in this particular battle space, this battle would end, again, in an 18-hour span, from its beginning point to its end point on day 1. Although following, again, would be sporadic uprisings that would be brutally crushed, especially by the People's Armed Police, whose task it was to crush any and all types of reactionary armed civilian uprisings and cleanse and pacify areas that would become the future of the New China colonization initiative, essentially establishing their red zone within the downtown Houston area. That was their prime directive. But at first, they would play their part in assisting in brutally suppressing and crushing the reactionary elements attempting to rise up alongside the military elements, as well as even fighting military elements in some areas, to assist their PLA brethren, who would be conducting the lion's share of the actual fighting, as they by far would be contributing the most forces, as the 83rd was again equipped with the latest and greatest hardware and was a relatively sizable PLA active duty group army. Going to the map of the Houston battle space, each of these as on all maps, represents a single heavy strategic bomber aircraft as a Tu-22M. Of course, these are the Su-27 fighters of the Su-27 Squadron. These are the PLAAF J-20 stealth fighters, although they're each shadowed by their wingman, their FH-97A stealth drone fighter. It's just showing the 12 fighters of the squadron. And then here are the J-10s, and the J-10, again, was produced in large numbers and was a mainstay within the PLAAF and a highly capable, very powerful, multi-role fighter aircraft. Although the metro area was a 15 by 15 mile area, the 3 additional brigades and 2 independent brigades, as in the entire headquarters battalion over the entire 83rd Group Army, as well as the Special Operations Battalion within the 83rd, and 3 additional brigades were off map. There were the Chemical Defense Brigade, as well as the Engineering Brigade, and another Combined Arms Brigade. The forces on this particular map were essentially 10 brigades, not counting the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade, which would show up much later after the major battle for the main portion of the metro area had since concluded, and they themselves, as in the Marines, will have already concluded just slightly to the south before moving up and then into the metro area, their own battle along the coastal areas near Galveston and Texas City, Texas. The 83rd PLA Group Army would be relieved by the 15th PLA Group Army of the external prong of 15 through 20. The group armies coming up after their victory in the McAllen battle had successfully concluded, as they would storm through the Corpus Christi area, which would have been by then already captured by a small contingent of Latin American elements that were part of the foreign expeditionary forces that were part of the overall larger coalition of forces of the Sino-Russian coalition, before proceeding on to I-10, from whence they would then travel all the way into the southeastern United States, staying along I-10. As these different brigades off map were also fanned out near I-10 to control some of the medium-sized cities along that route that lay immediately outside of the main metropolitan area of Houston itself. This is essentially Houston and its innermost suburbs, not counting its coastal suburbs or its easternmost suburbs. As Houston not only was a massive city by any metric, as well as also an industrial city, especially in terms of its petrochemical industries and energy industries, and manufacturing related to such especially, the control of the city was of vital importance to the coalition, as mentioned before. Also due to its proximity to the coast. And the downtown area would be rapidly captured by People's Armed Police shock forces traveling down some of the state highways before getting into downtown and receiving ample artillery support from the PLA's 83rd Artillery Brigade within the 83rd PLA Group Army. The air defense forces were also heavy in this area, And although there were some small military installations, including the Ellington Field, or the Joint Base Ellington, which actually had 5 of the military branches there, from the Coast Guard, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, they, without the Space Force, if that's counted, side note, they were the prime reception point before the battle even begun, receiving units that were either attached to or part of the 36th Infantry Division, which itself was the Texas National Guard's primary Army unit as a large unit. The 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment, as a part of the 36th ID, was deployed as a primary component of the city's defenses. Deployed with them were a few battalions from the 256th, who was attached to the 36th ID, the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. As in the 2nd Battalion of the 156th, which was a mechanized infantry force, as well as also the Artillery Battalion from the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team that would be deployed alongside of the Fires Squadron of the 278th ACR. And as these forces were, like in many cases across the land, sent to various places that had been temporarily leased by the federal and state regimes for their temporary bivouac locations until they could be sent to more direct areas to protect, such areas would come under heavy artillery, both rocket and howitzer, missile from cruise and tactical ballistic missiles, and strategic and tactical air raids from the air forces of the coalition, dropping and firing tremendous tonnage of ordnance upon these places, in addition to the volley of cruise missiles, not just from the container-disguised and base systems, such as the Russian Caliber Club Ks and Chinese YJ-18C container-disguised cruise missile systems, but also from the sea-based cruise missiles fired by Chinese subs and their Type 055 stealth destroyers, and also standoff missiles fired from aircraft in some cases as well, and those fired from the strategic missile forces of the PLA Strategic Missile Forces brigades that were operating in Mexico and in East Central Texas, relatively close to the Houston battle as well, in the form of the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade from the PLA Strategic Missile Forces Eastern Theater Command. Not only would establishing a red zone be of high importance to the PLA forces, but the capture of many of the critical airports for use as megafobs would be also of critical importance, as was the case all throughout the invasion in every corner of the nation, not even excluding, of course, the South Central invasion sector, which was a massive part of the entire nationwide invasion going on in every corner of it, as there were many critical aspects of America located in just this tri-state area, right in this area, in terms of its defense, in terms of its energy industries, and even in some cases in terms of its defense industries, as even components of its nuclear weapons program were located in the Texas Panhandle, such as the Pantex plant, also Los Alamos Labs. There was the Dyess Air Force Base, which was home to nukes and would be missiled out of oblivion and then overrun by coalition forces after all the delivery aircraft and bunkers were hit extremely hard. And elsewhere. And in Houston, this being a key energy and energy industrial site, including of its chemical and petrochemical industries in the nation, as well as key ports on this side of the nation, would absolutely be captured as much intact as was possible, while other patches of the city would lay in total abject ruination, as much from the air and missile strikes as it would from direct action by the ground forces, such as the brutal methods employed by the People's Armed Police shock forces of this brutally fanatical paramilitary element under CCP control, and also even from the artillery forces and crossfire meted out by the PLA 83rd Group Army. For the short-lived duration of the battle in Houston, the fighting would be highly savage, and over 1 million people would lose their lives in just the first day of fighting alone, which included the first 18 hours of the military-on-military fighting, followed up by hours afterward between reactionary elements that still wish to come up out of their hiding spaces to challenge their new occupation overlords, to tragic results. As there were multiple instances of combat occurring, as again, in similar fashion to other major city battles, as these different entities or brigades or other types of smaller units, even battalions within these combined arms brigades, each begun in a strategically purchased CCP property or series of such. Each of these combined arms brigades were responsible for a certain piece of the pie, if cutting it into spokes like a wheel. And multiple combat occurrences would be occurring all at the same time, as they all bashed their way into the center of the city, with the People's Armed Police surprisingly getting there relatively quickly and initiating the fighting in downtown, while the PLA forces mostly concerned themselves with seeking out and destroying the defending military forces outright. As there were 3 different entities, the naval combat forces in the form of their Marine Brigade and operating in the Houston suburbs to the south of the city, as well as the Army and the paramilitary People's Armed Police, each was given their own prime directives to pursue, and each would pursue them vigorously, with the attacking military forces acting a bit more humanely than possible as they were not given the directive to outright slaughter and butcher and pacify, as the euphemism went, the civilian population, such as was given to the PAP with glee that they carried it out. The crossfire dished out by the Army and Marine forces was still such that the heavy volumes of firepower laid down by them, even when attempting to keep it as precise as possible, was still of such a devastating magnitude that multiple tens of thousands of people died by the hour. The city became, in many portions of it, a burning hellscape, or at least a defaced rubble pile, cratered moonscape, unrecognizable from its former glory, as all the sights, smells, and images of warfare filled its streets. War that was once a distant concept in the minds of many Americans had now finally come home to roost and was a reality for them, whether they liked it or not. No matter how deep their delusion had been to the contrary, now it was real, and now they would have to adapt. Some would take up arms and fight right away. Others would wait a short time and do the same. Others yet still would take the very small window of time available to them and get the hell out of the way as fast as possible. As fast as their vehicles would carry them, and when vehicles failed because traffic backed up and because enemy forces closed in, as fast as their legs would carry them. Only those in vehicles who had fled at the first sign of trouble would be they who would actually get out with their vehicles. Everyone else would become trapped, and many butchered as a result. Others, who were also equally wise as those who had fled the area immediately at the first sign of trouble that stayed in hiding, would be they who would ultimately be able to carry on the fight into the insurgency/partisan uprising phase of the war, who realized and had the foresight to understand it was all about continuity and effectiveness of resistance, not about what they could prove in and of the moment. They understood that they would need, an absolute need, to reorganize, regroup, find people that were experts in their field, delegate responsibilities accordingly, and train up their people so that as people would be taken out over time, they could replenish with others, as this could become a cycle that those with the foresight to get organized the best would be able to withstand for a long time, if they took the proper precautions early on. There would even be some places in just this battle that would fall with very little fighting at all, simply due to the fact that the communications issues and ISR issues, not being able to know exactly where your enemy was coming from, what they had available to them, as in what were they armed with, what were their capabilities, where were they moving from, and where were they going to. The shock of it all would cause fighting to end prematurely, as some would just surrender because they wouldn't know what else to do. They wouldn't have the capability to do much of anything in the way of any type of semblance of organized, effective resistance beyond what they could organize within line of sight and within earshot, as always throughout the entire invasion, as that was a common theme this early on in the fighting. They would have to come up with better communications, and they would need time to do such and learn how to primitively communicate more effectively and do things such as come up with preordained plans that everybody would agree to stick to, which would prevent certain plans from falling apart at the seams as the things got rough over time. There would be multiple drones committed to this, every bit as much as the air power, which would be another factor, along with humongous quantities of loitering munitions that would end fighting in this battle much, much earlier than in some other instances. And again, there would not be the time afforded, like there was in the Waco battle, to produce adequate defenses of any sort. That would not exist here, just due to the magnitude of the forces involved, the air power involved, and the missile forces committed to this battle. The Battle of Houston will continue in the next videos. This has been the intro.